Good evening. My name's McKay, and I've been a paranormal investigator for over 20 years. Tonight's true story is the testimony of a captain's mate who claims a female vampire was a passenger on his ship in 1857 Michigan during the Victorian era. Although I can't confirm the validity of his vampire claim, I did some research and confirmed that the ship did actually exist. And I was also able to confirm the ending of our story, just as the captain's mate claimed in his testimony. I came across his testimony in the book titled Haunted Lake Huron by Frederick Stonehouse. A grateful thank you goes out to Frederick for allowing me to narrate this testimony. It's a dashing story, something you can really sink your teeth into. Shall we begin? It was in the fall of 1857. A woman chartered the ship from Buffalo to Chicago. She arrived at the dock well after dark in a closed carriage. Considerable amount of baggage accompanied her, including several large trunks and an unusual box about 5 feet long, 2 feet deep, and 2 feet wide. Since she wanted this in her cabin, a couple of the boys wrestled it in for her. The woman was very finely dressed and a great beauty in a dark and mysterious fashion. I'd guess her about 30 or so, with a very pale, almost white complexion. Her eyes were very dark, nearly black, and most engaging, nearly hypnotic. From her overall appearance, however, I guessed her to have been recently ill. The captain immediately escorted her to her cabin, and I noticed that she leaned heavily on his arm as he led her below. Within the hour, we were under the tow of one of the numerous little harbor tugs that brought us to the harbor mouth, and soon after, under easy sail bound west. We were sailing with a short crew, our regular men having left for their homes or other employment. Other than the captain and myself, there was the cook, an odd fellow named Hobbs, I think, a ship's boy, and 5 men forward. I also found a boy hanging around the local saloon and hired him, thinking that he could be of use helping the passenger. The first night out, everything went well, and I saw nothing of the woman. She did not come out of her cabin at all during the next day, and later that day I realized that I had not seen the boy about the ship. Neither had the captain, cook, or crew seen him either. He had just disappeared. Searching the ship failed to find him, so we had to assume he had somehow fallen overboard during the night. Just after dark, she came on deck, looking as beautiful as I remembered from my brief glimpse of the previous night. Although still somewhat pale, she did appear stronger. She walked over to the lee rail and just stood there, gazing out at the black lake. Her accent was unusual. I had traveled in Europe with my father as a youngster, but still could not place it. The next day, the woman stayed in her cabin for the day again. Later that evening, she came out of her cabin around midnight. said a brief hello to the captain, and then walked forward. Once she passed the foremast, she was too deep in the gloom to be seen. About 10 minutes later, she walked back to the stern, passing the captain without comment, and went directly down to her cabin. As dawn broke the following morning, the captain saw a man collapsed on the foredeck. Rushing forward, the captain immediately saw how pale his skin was and the lethargic look in his eyes. We both put it down to a case of the DTs, considering the quality of the crew. We did not see the woman that day either. Later that night, the woman came up from her cabin and gave no explanation for her absence during the day. She looked much better than the previous night. There was more color on her cheeks and her lips were pleasantly red. The Lake Huron must agree with her. She gave me a casual and cold good evening and took her lonely place at the rail. The next morning, the cook was too ill to make breakfast. His skin was ghastly white and eyes dull, as if he was in a trance. These were the same symptoms as the two sick crewmen. The captain told him to lie back in his bunk and take it easy. Although I'm not certain the man heard a word he said. Later that day, at dusk, the captain went below for what he said was a short nap and never came back topside. When he didn't respond to stomping the deck over his cabin or signal to him that his time was up, I went down to check on him. He seemed to have taken sick with whatever malady struck the cook and sailor down. He was dreadfully white and eyes absent all spark. My shaking could not fully waken him. I went back on deck and sent one of the men down to sit with him and to look on the cook too. Perhaps an hour later, the woman came up for her nightly air. If she was beautiful before, tonight she was positively ravishing. Her skin was flushed pink, and full lips literally glowed red. Her eyes were more sparkling than previously too. She gave me her cursory good evening and retreated to the lee rail. What a shame her personality did not match her beauty. The next day, it was found that the cook had passed away during the night. Whatever was striking down the crew was indeed fatal. Most odd was the evident loss of blood from the cook. The skin was almost white. Curious, I stuck my knife blade into his arm and there was no bleeding, only the barest hinting of redness. This was very strange. I'd never heard of any illness that would so destroy the blood. Later that day, well after nightfall, the woman came up on deck, as was by now her habit. She started to walk forward. The moon was sliding in and out of the clouds. When it was out, I could see the bow. When the clouds obscured it, I had trouble seeing as far as the mainmast. I noticed, though, that she appeared to glide rather than walk. Captured by her face, I had never noticed this before. But with her long flowing white gown. I was certain that this was just an illusion. I watched her carefully as she moved toward the bow, and then disappeared from view in the gloom. 10 or so minutes later, she recrossed the deck and descended the stairs to her cabin. Again, she seemed to glide rather than walk. Her motion was so graceful. The next morning, another man was found unconscious on the foredeck. Like the others, his skin was pale and he could not be roused. The 2 remaining crewmen and I would have a tough time bringing her to Chicago, but we resolved to continue. Then the storm struck. The first blast blew out the foretopsail. The wind increased by the minute, each gust more powerful than the last. I went below to see how the captain and woman passenger were faring. I knocked hard on her door, but got no response. Even considering the storm, she should have heard me. I opened the door, and she wasn't there. The box the crew had manhandled into the cabin was lying open on the floor. It was empty except for a thin layer of dirt. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a leg projecting from behind the box. It was the boy, and he was very dead. Like the others, he was nearly white. He had not fallen overboard after all. But what was he doing in the woman's room? Next, I went to the captain's cabin. When I opened the door, there she was, on her knees bent over him, her slender back toward me. She quickly looked up at me. I'll never forget the terrible scene before me. Blood was dripping from her lips, and her wild, glowing eyes burned with an unholy intensity. 2 short white fangs extended down from her mouth. I turned and started to flee from that horrible sight. At that very moment, the ship lurched violently, knocking the woman to the deck and throwing me hard against a bulwark. Being a sailor, I was more used to such extreme motion. I quickly recovered and ran up the companionway to the quarterdeck. The 2 men I had left at the wheel were gone, and the wheel itself smashed. Apparently, a massive wave had crashed aboard and swept them away. We were rolling wildly, caught in the very jaws of the storm. Thunder rolled overhead, and sharp flashes of lightning lit the night sky. Our poles were still up, but the strain on them was immense. They could not last long. The ship was doomed, as were all of us in her. Then the woman struck me from behind with tremendous force, sending me tumbling down the deck and crashing into the mainmast fife rail. Looking up, I saw her in all her evil. What kind of creature she was, What beast in human form? I do not know. In the cutting wind, she was the pure embodiment of the devil. Her white gown, torn and streaked black with the captain's blood, blew stiffly out behind her, as did her long black hair. Her eyes flashed red with a bloodlust unsatisfied. All this said, there was an evil beauty to her, undeniable in its power. As she advanced to me over the heaving deck, I was frozen to the tail and could not run, her glaring eyes riveting me to my place. I was caught, just as surely as any animal in a leg trap. In that instance, I finally realized that she was the cause of the strange sickness and death among the crew. Perhaps the storm was the consequence of the heavens lashing out against her evil. When she reached me, her powerful hands grabbed my shoulders and pulled me easily to my feet. Her strength was incredible. She gave a short growl, baring her sharp fangs, and lifted her head back, preparing to plunge them deep into my neck. Again, I could not move, held as motionless as a statue, as much by fear as by her hold. The ship suddenly pitched wildly, breaking her grip and forcing her to step backwards. I held fast to the fife rail. A tremendous clap of thunder boomed overhead, and a bolt of lightning shot to the main topmast, shattering it into several pieces. One of them, 5 or 6 feet long, fell directly to the deck, impaling the woman through her chest, just as Ahab struck the whale. I watched dumbly as her blood gushed black on the deck, only to be washed immediately away by the rain and wave wash. Mesmerized by the sight, I must have held to the rail for several minutes, watching as her lifeless body drifted to and fro across the deck. Then the ship went over, rolling bottom up, and I was thrown into the lake. Fighting my way back to the surface, I grabbed a floating hatch gate and hung on to it. The storm ended very soon after. After 6 or so hours, I came ashore at one of the Manitous. I was the only survivor. Well now, that was amusing, wasn't it? Have a pleasant evening, and sleep well.